Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, digitally detoxing myself by buying myself a typewriter and saying that this will improve my workflow. I'm not sure how, but we're going to find out.
It'll improve your workflow when you literally can't make a typo on whatever you're about to turn in.
It's high stakes, baby.
That's how we want it.
It's high stakes, no reward.
Well, that's how you know you're doing it for the love of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And I am Cameron Lalana, and my girlfriend and I are going to go see the Mountain Goats perform in October or November. I want to say October. So we've decided to listen to every one of the albums of the Mountain Goats, one album per week, and then having a discussion section. Just a discussion. We're just talking about it. So
You are the Mountain Goats TA.
I'm ready to enter my most annoying phase of life when I finally have conquered all there is to know about the Mountain Goats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I look forward to it.
But before we continue with the podcast, we just wanted to extend a quick thank you to our newest patron, Brenda. Brenda, thank you so much for helping us keep the show running. All right, on the show.
This is a podcast for me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. Today, we're going to be talking guerrilla warfare. Book 4, Part 3 of War and Peace. We're so close to being done, but we're not quite there.
We're not quite there, and we're not quite done with the number of people in the story dying.
No.
And after all this, no. After all this time you've invested in reading War and Peace, you probably want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your reading. That's why you need to head on over to patreon.com/tipsytolstoy, where we're going to be posting a reading guide for each episode. That includes a quick commentary on major quotes and themes. It'll help you understand the book better. And hey, it's been 5 months. Jesus, it has been 5 months. If you've been spending 5 months on this or whatever, is this episode 10 or 11 hours on this? Hey, why not learn a little bit more about each episode?
But in case you're not that interested in Patreon, but you still want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or sign up for our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
But before we get into the reading today, Matt, I've got to ask you, what are you what are you drinking today?
I am drinking Not Your Father's Root Beer. It's root beer, but it's got alcohol in it. It has become fastly a guilty pleasure of mine.
All right. Well, nothing wrong with a little bit of alcoholic root beer,
Nothing
or
wrong.
a lot of bit of
Nothing wrong.
alcoholic root beer.
Yeah. What do you got over there?
I've got a stout, typical. It's called an 8-ball stout. Unclear to me if 8-ball is the name of the beer or if 8-ball is the type of beer it is, which I've never heard of that before, but it could be new. From Lost Coast Brewery up in Yreka, California. And I should point out that it is Yreka, California, which is the good Yreka, as opposed to Yreka, which is just Yreka but spelled with a Y instead of an EU. I don't actually know if Yreka is pronounced Yreka, but that is how everyone that I have ever met in California pronounces that town name, because it's important to differentiate Yreka from Yreka because they're actually not that far apart. Anyway, I am eternally mad about how towns in Northern California name themselves, but that's a subject for a different podcast.
For our next podcast.
Just Cameron yelling about different towns I've been to in Northern California.
Well, instead of towns, what do we have to get mad about today? And is it guerrilla warfare?
Guerrilla warfare, prisoner executions, I guess you can get mad about.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the guerrilla warfare part. So I'm so excited about this. Last time I talked a little bit about how I was ready to talk about this part, but that's I should say part of my degree. I know every time I describe my degree, it sounds like a different thing, and that's because my degree was very unfocused, but focused on studying warfare itself. And one of my favorite parts about studying this was studying irregular warfare, or what's the term for it? Asymmetrical warfare, or there is an actual state-to-state dyadic warfare. Whatever. I'll edit it in later, maybe.
The degree is gone. It's done.
Yeah, I got to give my degree back at this point. But studying irregular or state on non-state actor warfare was my particular favored area of study, because that is really the dominant form of warfare for the last 100 years or so. So that's something I've always been very interested in and really got into, and I'm ready to talk about it here.
Let's do it. It was a good part.
It was a good part. So before we get into it, Matt, is there anything you wanted to lead in with?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a super profound point, but this is the part of the book in which I kind of fell off last time. Like, I was still reading it, but I think there's something that changes, and I'm not exactly sure where it does. I feel like Tolstoy loses track of his own story, and it really is just him hammering home the points that he wanted to make sure you didn't miss.
Right. Well, yeah, we're going to be hitting on the classics of historians don't understand history, militaries don't really run by the way their leaders want them to run, and also history is driven by an X factor, which we don't tend to study.
And kind of new for this part, which is Jesus Christ wouldn't have wanted this, which I feel like comes a little out of left field.
The strong Christian morality, and I use that very intentionally. I read your notes, so I know that this is something that's on your mind too. But towards the end, where he's like, "This is what the Lord our God has deigned, and that's how we know that this is right," does come, as you say, a little out of left field.
Yeah, you can see why he goes through, I don't know, like 30 or 40 more years of spiritual crisis after writing this.
Yeah, right. So this part is going to be mostly focusing on the characters you care, I know the most about: Denisov, Dolokhov, and Petya Rostov. So just in case you're wondering, we are now 1,100 pages into a book, and we're focusing on background characters. So this is some classic Tolstoy.
Got the B cast out there.
If this was anyone but Tolstoy, I would definitely not let this slide, but he's built up some goodwill at this point. But anywho, so let's talk about part 3. This part is pretty heavy on Tolstoy philosophizing about history, so this is going to be a pretty short summary section to say he opens up on about 2 parts of talking about the laws of history, which we've talked about quite a lot before, so I'm not going to go over what he says, but he does apply them specifically into the science, quote unquote, of warfare. Now, this is pretty important because the modern science of warfare is a diffuse subject. Let me say that there are multiple strands which don't necessarily intersect that much. There is the sort of study of warfare which you would get in a military college, which is something that I will say I'm not that familiar with, and it derives from roughly this era of warfare. Of course, with addendums and additions and revisions from many later eras. But like, this is the era of warfare when the idea of wars, laws of war are laid down, where you start getting your Frederick the Greats, your Napoleons, your sort of ideas of military rightness, which carries forward. And I'm not going to say that those eras are all that relevant to today, but they are relevant in the sense that Freud is still relevant to modern psychology, in which that you don't necessarily apply those concepts on a day-to-day basis, but it led to a chain reaction, people reacting positively or negatively to those beliefs, which continues on through time until you get to a modern study. That is mostly separate from what I will call the academic study of warfare, which is on the whole much more statistical and data-based than it is philosophy-based, as is the military study of warfare. And the point I'm trying to make here is that what Tolstoy is talking about when he talks about historians in this part, he's specifically, for the most part, talking about these writers and these people who are laying down these ideas of warfare as, oh, this is correct warfare, which leads into, I think most notably, these notions of warfare lead especially into World War I later on, which if you know anything about World War I, historical battle doctrine applied to the advent of the machine gun did not work out super well for anyone in the European theater. But I say all this to cover the fact that this is just Tolstoy going in on this sort of military side study of warfare, arguing that these ideas of science is a misapplication of the term. And in fact, he says in one of his Tolstoy's side points, which are as more correct than maybe even he knew, he says the science of warfare doesn't mean anything because, well, what about guerrilla warfare, which is always successful in the face of this idea of science of modern military application of warfare, which perhaps grew out of Tolstoy's own experience in Chechnya, which was a sort of a warfare between a state military and a non-state military, a non-state actor, as you might say. And was a guerrilla warfare and did end in, despite a great number of victories, individual battles won on the Russian military side and overall loss in the conflict, which has maintained pretty true to today.
Sure.
Tolstoy is pretty much correct on military science historicism here, in which guerrilla warfare is never good, never successful in a sense, but it always kind of wins.
Yeah, I feel like he also gets kind of into the ethics of military warfare, because remember there was that quote that gets taken out of context all the time, which was something to the effect of, well, if I can't remember exactly what it was, but if everybody goes to war, then there would be no war, right? Or if everybody acted truly according to their own convictions, then there would be no war. And Tolstoy has this kind of give and take with the tension on this in this particular chapter on what it means to be, subjugated, right? Are you subjugated because your military loses, or are you subjugated because, your band of fighters has lost? And in some ways, it almost makes it seem like guerrilla warfare is actually more ethical, which is kind of interesting. I've been ruminating on this.
Yeah, I want to come back to that once we're done with this, but
yeah, it's really interesting the way that it works itself out.
This is I think to me one of the most interesting parts of this story. But that's just the first 2 chapters. Following that, we join the top-down view of the war, where the French are continuing their warfare. At this point, after these former battles, after leaving Moscow, after Borodino, they are essentially leaving. They're trying to retreat from the Imperial Russian territory, and they are just pulling their prisoners out. They're getting out. They care nothing for the so-called laws of warfare, as Tolstoy puts it, and the army itself is disintegrating down to the individual. So these laws of history, which Tolstoy has harped on, it becomes more apparent, as he would have you believe. And as a side point, because Kutuzov, at this point, for the most part, does not want the actual military to engage in actions against this retreating French military, because, as Tolstoy will say time and time again, why on earth would you bother sending troops into a battle to die against an enemy that's already retreating, which is what you wanted? Although there are some actions which take place, I think we covered in the last part, most of the warfare at this point is happening in guerrilla warfare against, small individual units carrying on a warfare against these retreating French forces. And one of those units we join is actually being run by our friend Denisov. If you don't recall Denisov super well, he's the one who speaks with a lisp isn't the correct word. He's the one who replaces R's with W's and sounds a little childlike. He's the one who tried to marry Natasha when she was 13.
Lest we forget.
Yeah, lest we forget. But is now leading this group of partisans who are attacking the French. One rainy morning, an officer comes up to give them some orders, and after reading those orders, Denisov realizes, wait, you're Rostov. Not Nikolai, as you might be expecting, but Petya Rostov, who joined the story way far back many years ago as a child, who is now a youth of, I believe, not quite 20, but still fairly young, who has joined the military against the wishes of his parents and is now delivering orders. And Petya is so taken in with these partisans who are such, gruff, kind of the sort of men he imagines are the ones he wants to be. He's very taken with them, and he joins them despite his superior officer commanding him to return immediately afterwards, because his commanding officer knows that Petya, much like his older brother, has kind of a hot head and is willing to rush right into battle if it seems glorious. That leads them into a larger series of events where they are reconnoitering a French camp, which previously they'd sent in someone to go kidnap some people. That didn't quite work out. They find that person. They take him back home, Tikhon, and they realize that Tikhon had actually found someone, but had actually killed that person and went back to look for more soldiers, which had led to his capture, thus leading to the escape as they're reconnoitering, which I only bring up because that is something that Petya will reflect upon. The fact that Tikhon, this man who's so funny, so genial, had, executed someone in cold blood for not being the right capture.
Haha, oops.
Haha, oops. This is the part of warfare where it's getting really brutal. I mean, warfare itself is brutal enough, but I guess there's something we said about the sort of brutality of the heat of passion of everyone shooting each other, and then there's something we said about the brutality of you're not the right person for information, so I guess I'm gonna cut your throat in this dark forest.
Also, I do think that this is the first time that Petya has consciously thought that someone could die in war and seen what that looks like, because he's really young.
He's up to this point, Petya has only existed in the novel as a child. This is the first time we've seen Petya as, I hesitate to say an adult because he's not an adult, but one who plays at such.
Well, he's seen as an adult and thus able to participate in the war, but clearly what Tolstoy is showing us is that he's really not emotionally developed to the point that he should be given a gun and sent off to kill people.
Right, yeah. Tolstoy says people who are just turned 18 should not be ready to be mobilized as soldiers.
No.
Yeah. So as Petya is there, Dolokhov comes and up and has his own mission. Dolokhov at this point is now the ideal soldier, it's mentioned. He's dressed up exactly as he should be. I believe the last time we saw Dolokhov, I think we were in Voronezh, I think. Before that, he was off on his Persian adventure. Dolokhov by far has the most interesting story through this entire book, which is entirely an implication, which I appreciate. It's very funny to me. Mm-hmm. But Dolokhov basically says, I'm going to go reconnoiter the French camp by infiltrating, and Petya insists against Denisov's wishes. This isn't exactly said, but Denisov remembers Petya. He remembers him as a child for the most part, probably because Denisov tried to marry Petya's sister when she was a child, but he has this sort of, it's not said, but sort of paternal need to protect Petya, and initially shoots him down, but Dolokhov eventually talks them into letting Petya go. They go off and do their reconnoitering. They enter the French camp, both pretending to be French officers because they are both fluent French speakers, gain a little bit of information, come back, and feed that back. And Petya, for his part, after this whole event, which is so terrifying to him that he is basically silent the entire way through, comes back. Denisov has stayed up this entire night waiting for Petya and is finally able to fall asleep when Petya is back. Petya wanders out into this camp of partisans who are camping in the forest and sees not the real world. He does not see the hard reality of what they're facing, which is an incredibly brutal, one of the most brutal wars you could imagine. He sees, because he's still essentially a child, a fantasy land. He sees not the fires of soldiers, trying to stay warm through the night. He sees, some kind of fantasy thing, something much grander. As he asks a Cossack to sharpen his sword, he falls asleep to this idea of grandeur in the night and imagines a symphony which he controls, which carries through till the next day, in which they decide to attack. The attack goes fairly well, with the exception that Petya, who rushes out ahead of the forces they have, ends up shot in the head and falls off his horse and dies without much fanfare.
Well, the fanfare is them shouting back and forth to each other, "Done for, done for." That's it.
Yeah. As Dolokhov announces to Denisov, who then, white-facedly goes to collect Petya's body. And once they've attacked this French camp, which is successful on the partisans' part, they free many Russian prisoners. They free about 100 or less than 100 Russian prisoners. And I use Russian loosely to mean affiliated with the Imperial Russian Empire. Not all of them are ethnic Russians. Some of them are German soldiers or, many others who are involved in this conflict. But among that group is Pierre. At this point, we jump back to Pierre's experience of this war, which has been pretty bad. It's not been great as they've been marching back out of the Imperial Russian Empire. It has been tough. It has been, if you are sick, if you are slow, if you fall behind the others, you are shot. You die by hunger, you die by cold, you die by having nothing but horse meat and saltpeter to eat. But Pierre, for his part, has sort of attained a sort of evenness, I will say, about it. He discovers some sort of truths about the world I'm going to opine later on more about the philosophical implications about this. Despite what he says, it really just feels like a precursor to PTSD, in that he stops caring and stops noticing how many people are dying around him. You can philosophize all you want. That is I feel like just a trauma response, but hey, who am I to judge? I'm just a guy. Among the people who die are his friend Karatayev, who we talked about last time in relation to wisdom. In this point, Karatayev one day very tiredly sits down in a tree and is unable to carry on and is shot by French soldiers. But before Pierre is really able to come to terms with this, and I don't say that as it happens soon after, but Pierre has his mind does not accept the idea that Karatayev is dead for at least a day, maybe more. That is when we catch up with the forces of Denisov attacking the camp and freeing the Russian prisoners. Pierre has some dreams, which we'll talk about later, and then the prisoners are freed, and we carry forward with not so much an actual examination of what happens following the battle, but Tolstoy again going on about historians reviewing this period of history and his problems with how they have categorized greatness, specifically this idea of which is now commonly referred to as great man theory of history, and especially historians talking about the Russian side of the equation for how this went down, which we'll also talk about more. But that's probably the shortest summary we've done so far, because it really is not a lot of story here, but there is a lot of ideas here, albeit some ideas which have been put forth before, but also a lot of, I would say, not entirely new, but interestingly different ideas Tolstoy's putting forth. But is there anywhere you want to start in particular?
I feel like you were really excited to talk about guerrilla warfare, and I would be a bad co-host if I didn't give you a bit of a lead-in.
Thank you. Well, I am really excited to talk about guerrilla warfare because, so he talks specifically, Tolstoy in chapter 2 gets into the science of warfare. And this gets more into I will say this is sort of an intersection between the academic and the military study of warfare, because the military study of warfare really is engaging with how do you win wars. And the academic side of the study of warfare really engages more with, it's not so much how do you win wars, but it's more so how do you predict war? What are the circumstances under which you can expect war to break out? What are the circumstances under which you can expect nationalist groups to militarize? What are the circumstances under which you might reliably see peace agreements to hold, to become stable, become durable, as the term is? But he gets into an interesting intersection between the two fields here, in which he says, and this is a very, I will say, 19th century idea of warfare, in that he critiques the study of warfare, because the idea is larger formations are going to beat smaller formations. That's the basic building block. That was the building block in maybe the 19th century. It's not so much now, but that's its own thing. Let's engage with him at his own time. And he says, okay, so it's not just about people, because it's also about morale to some degree. How much do they want to fight? But it's also, how can you say that what causes success in warfare is this specifically? I have no evidence in front of me which can point to this specifically being it. So instead, this factor which causes success in warfare, I will call factor X. And it's not anything we've known, or at least even if it is one of these things we've known to be a successful factor in warfare, we don't have evidence for it being the reliable factor X which causes victory. So what is victory caused by? It's caused by factor X. And he argues, in short, that it's a battlefield factor. He argues that while some argue that X is a battlefield factor, and battlefield factor includes things like weather, troops, whatever, he argues that it's really, X is an army spirit. And he comes up with a sort of equation for warfare. And the math itself doesn't really matter. But what he says is that
it doesn't, but it sure does matter that he makes you read a mathematical equation when you're like, oh, good, I'm almost done with the book. Boom! Just left hook.
Left hook, you're 1,100 pages in. Time to start engaging with mathematics.
The thing that everybody loves. Right.
So he comes with this equation of warfare. And the basic idea is that Tolstoy says, I think X is like an army spirit. But, however, if we, instead of coming to a definite conclusion of what this factor X is, what if we instead start comparing warfare and use this math formula I have created to try to derive principles, to compare these knowns and unknowns, to start analyzing the unknowns. And he says, only then, quote, expressing known historic facts by equations and comparing the relative significance of this factor, can we hope to define the unknown? And I think that's interesting because, as I mentioned several times before, one of my favorite things about Tolstoy is that he just dips his toes into fields that will not exist for like 10, 20, or 100 years. Mm-hmm. And, in What Is to Be Done, he dips his toes into Marxist or socialist ideas. He's dipped his toes into what you might call Hannah Arendt's ideas of the banality of evil, whatever you think of that. And here he's dipping his toes into the science of warfare, the study of warfare, for ideas that won't become broadly relevant until much, much later down the line. And although his ideas are not very complex, very developed, or they've been thoroughly surpassed by modern thought on the idea, I think it's just so interesting that he just dips his toes into something that is a very basic idea of thought that will not be thoroughly developed for quite a while by other people. Just it's enjoyable, and it's interesting that he is specifically addressing this place of guerrilla warfare at this time, especially from his position, and addressing it as we talked about, as one which it tends to be successful, which not every guerrilla war is successful, and guerrilla warfare is a deeply destructive form of warfare, but it is by and large the dominant form of warfare we see today. And if a guerrilla fights a state, the guerrilla maybe is more accurately described as a form of warfare. The non-state actor engaging in guerrilla war does tend to win. So he pretty much called it on that one.
Well, he lays out this factor too, which is, again, going back to this quote, which I wish I had written down because it is important, when he's earlier talking about how basically we're only able to go to war because it is under this facade of having almost a sort of like gentleman's war, which is basically what's depicted in the book. But so what happens when you get Dolokhov versus like Nikolai Rostov, who's going to be, running away and throwing his weapon into the bushes? Meanwhile, you have Dolokhov, who's like a patented psychopath. You get a group of them together. I mean, 5 of them could have taken down Napoleon, probably.
Right. I think, well, I don't know if this is exactly what you're talking about, but towards the very beginning of this part, he says the period of this campaign says, it proved that the force which decides the fate of peoples lies not in conquerors, not even in armies, in battles, but in something else. He's leading up to his Factor X there, but also the people, the individuals, the psychotic Dolokhovs who are willing to do whatever.
Yeah. I think that I think it just shows that Tolstoy was really well read and kind of well in tune with his own time, because I think what you are seeing actually is like a continuation of where Russia was at this time, which was heavily influenced by German philosophy, and where you see like these academic disciplines and where you see the relationship between those and what we have now. It's really only because we also are extremely influenced by German philosophy. This whole idea of the West is built on that. And so Tolstoy is critiquing a fundamental idea of German philosophy, right? And so I think that that's why you can see, he actually kind of almost precedes some of these things that we think of now as givens. And, actually, he had foreseen that this might be an issue. The fact that we calculate everything, right, trying to get down to the most minuscule level. But we're stuck because there's something that we can't predict. There's something that cannot be reduced to math. And yes, it is a provocative and good point. But also, yes, he does say it so many times.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that's also I know you said you kind of fell off of this part. I feel like I'm almost re-energized by this part, because when he's talking about warfare in this part, he's talking about a departure from rules of warfare. And one of the ways he expresses that is this line: after the burning of Smolensk, a war began which did not follow any previous traditions of war. The burning of towns and villages, the retreats after battles, the blowtilt at Borodina, and the renewed retreat, the burning of Moscow, the capture of marauders, the seizure of transports, and the guerrilla war were all departures from the rules. Now, this is, on one level, if you know anything about colonial war in the 1800s and the late 1700s, you know this is not all that new. However, this is perhaps new in its infliction within the European continent. Even that's not really true. That's true within the perspective of empire, I guess I'll say. But that's why I started getting energized in this, because it starts to engage with this form of warfare, which at this point has largely been relegated to the peripheries of empire. This, like the burnings of town and villages, retreats after battles. And that's why I'm energized, because he's getting into talking about how the science of warfare, up to this point, he's been trying to demonstrate it's not real, it's fake, it's just an idea we all hold up. But now when you get into the fact that this warfare, which is not driven by these so-called great men, you know, this warfare driven by these so-called great men, the Tsar, the Napoleons, they have these false rules, this idea, but when it starts to be driven by individuals like Denisov carrying on this partisan warfare, it takes on an entirely separate element, which is much more successful to Tolstoy's perspective. Maybe not because it's necessarily away from these so-called great men, but because it's a fight of the people to a degree. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it starts to be interesting to me. I guess it renews a sort of energy for it, because we start getting into discussions of, as he's talked about, his interest is in history driven by people, and partisan warfare is like in terms of studying warfare, this is the exact idea he's talking about. This is a warfare which can only be carried on by the people. Partisan warfare can only be notable, be successful, if it is a genuine will of a coherent group of people. Maybe not connected, but, you know, coherent in one form or another. So that's what makes it interesting to me. It doesn't have that sort of falsehood of this imperial warfare, which has these Napoleons who give orders which aren't necessarily followed, but are just responded, the realities are responded to.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's also funnier, I think.
Yeah.
Pretending to be French and just going in, being mean enough that they let you in.
Right.
And then just walking away because you were really mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's much bloodier. I will say this is also a very cold-blooded part of the book. The fact that these group of partisans, they capture French soldiers. They have, among them, they have a French drummer boy who most of them treat not badly, but just like a joke. And Petya, who's the only one among them who is not a partisan, who still holds these ideas of how you treat people, feels bad for him. He's like, he comes into this camp, he starts giving all these partisans, oh, take my flint, take my knife, take their raisins. I don't need it. I've got so much of these. And he looks up to these guys. But then he also thinks of the prisoners, and he thinks he's worried about being seen as less than manly, less than adult, because he's worried about the prisoners. But he wants to go make sure that this French drummer boy is fed, which is not necessarily something that this group of people who he seems opposed to, but this is a worry he has. And, you know, in many other perspectives, you know, when Dolokhov comes in and says, oh, yeah, let me take Petya because he speaks French, Denisov tries to block him, and Dolokhov kind of makes fun of Denisov's like, oh, what do you care about life now? Every time you send out 100 prisoners back to camp, 30 make it, and you say that death's not on your back because they didn't die in your care. If you knowingly send these group of people, of which, you know, most of them are going to die, it's really quite hypocritical for you to start caring about lives now. And Tikhon executing this unknown French soldier in the forest, which, as we mentioned earlier, Petya feels uncomfortable around. It is a realer war in a way. It is one that's genuinely driven by the individual desires of these people to see their land free from these foreigners. It's also a dirtier war. It's a darker war by far. And I think that's what makes it interesting to me. We're really getting into these, like, a real moral discussion between Denisov and Dolokhov, between Denisov trying to maintain some sort of moral standard, which you might recognize, and Dolokhov coming in saying, really, you care about that moral standard just because these dozens of people die when they're not under your care, even though that was a potentially foreseeable outcome, but then also using that sort of moral relativism. And I'm going to use this term very specifically because that is the underlying point that Tolstoy was trying to make here, that but that we should have some sort of moral standard which maintains for everyone. This sort of moral relativism for Dolokhov of, I don't care about you necessarily killing these prisoners, but I care about you pretending like you've still maintained some sort of moral high ground. So I am not going to pretend like I have that high ground, and therefore I'm just going to do the worst things and not care about it.
Yeah, it's not something to emulate, I don't think. Well, it's definitely an example of how you can kind of twist it to sort of make it seem like you're in the right.
Yeah.
And it is kind of a cry for a sort of fixed moral standard, I think, which he does give at the end of the book, or the end of this part.
Yeah, this is, I would argue this is the whole point of this part, is him arguing for an idea of moral consistency.
Sure.
But before we get to this idea, because I think that really is the main idea, let's talk about Pierre, because that is the other half of this part.
Yeah, he won't go away.
He said, okay, I will say a philosophical journey, that is the text of the book, and I think it is important to analyze the text of the book. It is important not to overlay too much of our own personal ideas onto it. Those can be engaged with, not as an overriding feature, I think. However, I think Pierre's entire part of this book could also be attributed, if this were a real person, to just developing PTSD from an incredibly traumatic event. But there is... It should be engaged with on its own level. So let's talk about Pierre.
Yeah, we can. I don't think it is PTSD because I don't think Tolstoy's thought about it like that, and so he's not going to write him like that.
Yeah, no, this is. I'm not saying we should psychologize this view of the book. That is a thoroughly modern view. I think it should be engaged with its own time, its own perspective, and its own piece. However, it is just hard not to, because Tolstoy is so good at writing these people as real people, view it as like, yeah, you could see this philosophically. You could also see this as shell shock.
Yeah, you could. But I'll argue for a different reading. Not because I think it's necessarily the one that would have truly happened in the situation, but just because I think it's probably more along the lines of Tolstoy's own philosophy, but I'm not... Mm-hmm. I'm not tied to it. You can argue with me. I'd be okay with it. So there's this strand that's continued from the last part where Pierre is talking about what it's like to be deprived of everything that you love and like in life, and why that should make you feel happy. And there's this quote where the narrator says, while imprisoned in the shed, Pierre had learned, not with his intellect, but with his whole being, that man is created for happiness, that happiness lies within him, in the satisfaction of natural human needs, and that all unhappiness arises not from privation, but from excess. And so it's kind of interesting because I feel like the last part we were in that we were talking about Pierre, he was really into this sort of ascetic kind of, orientation towards the world after he was kind of being taken prisoner in Moscow and deprived of basically everything. And Tolstoy kind of gives you a sort of mediating line here where he's not saying, you don't need to be deprived really from everything to be happy ultimately, but unhappiness does come from having these sort of excesses. And it's kind of an interesting middle ground, I think, that he ultimately strikes, because it doesn't have that sort of strict asceticism that's really present in, for instance, the Orthodox tradition in the Desert Fathers, where you just go out, live in the desert, you got nothing but sand, and you're just praying for years straight. It's not quite that extreme. I think it's a more sort of neutral, attainable goal that he sets out. So it's still ascetic, but it's not exactly extreme, I wouldn't say. And then he does also here draw this distinction between his intellect and his whole being, which I would need to check the translation on, but I'm guessing Tolstoy is drawing on this Orthodox conception of understanding with your mind versus your heart, which are two different things in the theology. This is what the book is getting at, though, ultimately, right? Like, not everything is able to be understood with your mind. Some things need to be understood through just what it feels like to experience them. And that's impossible for me to tell you what that feels like, because, again, the whole point is you have to go and experience that. And that's something that's really big in War and Peace so far. And if you're wanting further reading, you could take a look at anything that Gary Saul Morrison has written on prosaics. If you're interested in how Tolstoy uses this kind of exact thesis to build a foundation of literally everything that he writes. You can check it out. That's what I got to say on that. Pierre,
yeah. Do you mind if I read a line here to
Sure.
think about? And now, during the last 3 weeks of this march, he had learned still another new conciliatory truth, that nothing in the world is terrible. He had learned that as there is no condition in which man can be happy and entirely free, so there is no condition in which he need be unhappy and lack freedom. He learned that suffering and freedom have their limits, and those limits are very near together, that the person in a bed of roses with one crumpled petal suffered as keenly as he did now, sleeping on the damp earth with one side growing chilled while the other was warming. So I read that just because, not because I think you should take this as, oh, this is still, as Pierre's ultimate philosophy, it's still developing over time, and I'm sure it will develop more before the end of this book. But because he sort of comes to a form of acceptance, which, to your point of the asceticism last time, this isn't really specifically towards happiness being not really unrelated to the conditions in which you're in, but one which sort of the individual, I guess the internal life means so much more than the external life, which kind of comes to an apex in after Karatayev is shot for falling behind, and Pierre falls into the stream, not fully understanding that Karatayev is dead, in which he sees a globe in a class taught by an old teacher of his, in which the globe has many drops, each one kind of merging and fighting and trying to create its own space, and the teacher being like, yeah, that's basically life. Every drop is trying to make its own space, but every other drop also prevents that drop from finding its own space. So the nature of life is spreading out, trying to occupy, compressing, destroying, and sometimes merging. I don't know if I have a coherent point to draw from Pierre coming to this sort of not asceticism, but acceptance of the life around him, as the nature basically he's drawing at this point is just the point that Tolstoy has been trying to hammer into your head as the narrator this entire point, in which, the sort of sense of ultimate freedom doesn't exist. It can only exist within the boundaries under which other people allow it to be such by their own desires in their life, and that creates conflict in life. But
it's kind of a tough point to swallow if you're going to accept this as advice from Tolstoy to you, which I don't know if you should personally, but it is definitely what he's saying, I think. Which is that happiness is not what we think of as happiness. Happiness is not exhilaration. It is not the sort of adrenaline rush that you get when something good happens to you. It is not the sort of, sugar high that you get from, drinking, consuming anything. It is simply being content in the moment internally. And that's a much different conception of happiness than we have. I think in some ways that is a good thing that you can draw on to try to, be more present in your everyday life. I'm not sure that that's advice that works for everyone in all situations. I think, generally if your externals are taken care of, it's a little bit easier to be internally content than not. But, I mean, I don't know. I don't know anything, so don't listen to me. And of course he uses Pierre, who spent this time is basically just a military prisoner, and he's like, oh, look, he can be happy, so can you.
Right.
Pierre's a better man than me. I could not be happy in this situation, I don't think.
Yeah, I think most people would probably not love being in a situation under which they are exhausted, tired, freezing, and if that affects their performance whatsoever, they can be shot to death.
Right. Right. But the Karatayev thing is interesting. He gets a long outro, if you will.
Right. He gets his whole Pierre not accepting his death. Before that he also tells an entire story under which Pierre thinks about for a while.
The story is quite interesting, I would say. I don't know if you found it, inspiring.
I found it interesting.
It's not inspiring.
It is not inspiring. So the story that Karatayev tells is the story of a man who is falsely accused of a crime, has his nose ripped off, and is sent to a labor camp for 10 years for this crime that he did not commit. And while he's there, he meets someone who realizes what's happened and feels so bad about it that he admits to the crime, And the Tsar finds out. The Tsar commits a pardon for this guy, but before the pardon reaches him, he dies in this camp. Which, I mean, his nose has already been ripped off, and he's already been sent to a camp for 10 years, so I don't know if it was going to mean that much at that point, but hey.
Mm-hmm.
But what Pierre takes away from the story is less, as it is noted in the text, less the story itself and more the sort of mystical belief imbued within Karatayev, as he tells us, this sort of genuine belief, whatever that belief may be, that excitement to tell the story is what Pierre kind of takes away from it.
Yeah.
A belief in something, I guess.
He sees this real wisdom in simplicity, which I personally do not. Not always, at least. There's the whole passage about, he sees the world so differently now because he has these simple truths that he has now come to see. Even though I would probably argue that there were a lot of other simple truths that he also used to see at other points in the book.
Right. Well, what I took away from it was that Pierre is getting down to brass tacks in the sense that of all these complex ways of seeing right and wrong, it became less about this philosophical truth and more about just the kind of brass tacks of what is right towards your fellow man, which Tolstoy himself then harps upon in the following chapters when he takes historians to task, at least historians of his own time, and he hates this idea of greatness, this term that historians have come up with, the greatness in a person, which seems to exclude standards of right or wrong for Tolstoy. And this idea of great man theory is something that certainly existed in history, as we've talked about before. It is something that I think modern historians are largely wary of. I should note, it's something that is seen as a past phenomenon, but it was one that was pretty important for a great deal of time. So when Tolstoy's harping on this idea of this relative good or bad, which is infected by the strain of calling someone great. If someone becomes a great person, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, whatever, if they become great historically, then anything can go for them. I think a lot of what Pierre is getting at is this simplicity of belief really comes down to it's not my place to decide in a lot of ways what is right and what is wrong. It is simply, there is a standard of right or wrong, which is set by, not that Tolstoy would say it, but set by the Bible, set by, the Christian God.
No, he does say it here. He says the standard of good and evil is given to us by Christ.
Right, yeah, he does say that, exactly.
Yes, he sure does. Which I don't think he did before, but it's interesting because I feel like what he's trying to get to is what is the core of Christianity and how can we cut away anything excess that we don't need? I think that's like how he's approaching it. I'm not passing value judgment on that. But yeah, it's interesting though, because that same kernel is just taken right over to Crime and Punishment. Like this is the core of Crime and Punishment. Right.
I saw your notes and I saw that you were comparing this to Dostoevsky, and I thought that was a really interesting point, that this sort of moral specificity is a feature of a lot of Dostoevsky's work, but not typically associated with Tolstoy. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, and it's impossible to really know what was, because I mean these are written like right at the same exact time, and so it's impossible to know exactly whether these two authors are inspiring one another or if this is just a very common feature that arises because everyone's starting to now try to reconceptualize what it meant to be invaded by Napoleon. But it's interesting. Napoleon's a super interesting figure that really has his sort of heyday in the Russian romantics, and then gets transposed from there into Russian realism. It's fascinating, but right, that same moral core is interesting. I don't know. Again, this is a really great counterpoint to when people say, for instance, like Dostoevsky is more complex than Tolstoy. I don't know. There's some really challenging parts of War and Peace that I wouldn't exactly just say, yeah, it's easier to understand.
Right. But to narrow in on what I think Tolstoy was kind of saying in this part, do you mind if I'm going to go for a bit of a longer quotation here? This is when Tolstoy is narrowing in on his hatred of historians.
As you do.
And he writes, first of all, greatness, it seems, excludes the standards of right and wrong. For the great man, nothing is wrong. There is no atrocity for which a great man can be blamed. And that's followed by later on, and this also has some French, which I've just gone ahead and broadly translated in English for ease of understanding in an audio format. It is great, say the historians, and there no longer exists either good or evil, but only great and not great. Great is good, and not great is bad. Great is the characteristic in their conception of some special animal called hero. And Napoleon, escaping home in a warm fur coat and leaving to perish those who were not merely his comrades, but were, in his opinion, men he had brought there, feels that it is great and his soul is tranquil. And it occurs to no one that to admit a greatness is not commensurate with the standard of right or wrong, is merely to admit one's own nothingness and immeasurable meanness. So he's not too much to analyze here. He just goes deep on this idea of creating standards of good or bad, which are unrelated to standards of, morally right, morally wrong, being something that is a great flaw in studying history, because it allows evil people to be in connection with Dostoevsky, right? We previously talked about in especially Crime and Punishment, the kind of Dostoevsky makes fun of the idea of especially in Raskolnikov is trying to create this, I think the term we use is like a kinder, more humane Napoleon as a term of derision. And that's kind of is what this term great does, is it creates a kinder, more humane Napoleon in which humanity and kindness is irrelevant. Less so, it's not like you're trying to create this individually kind, great person, but you're trying to create this person to whom kindness and these other features which are good or closer would have you hold are good are irrelevant too. And he wants you to believe that's a bad thing. And that's another overlap with, Crime and Punishment, which I think it's interesting, this part specifically where you start to see that sort of Dostoevskian or language we'd recognize as Dostoevskian become so prevalent.
I think you're right. I think this part's kind of, pulling back into it a little bit on the second read. I think it's okay. I think War and Peace is still a good book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's still okay.
War and Peace, Tipsy Tolstoy says, it's okay. It's an okay novel.
I'm not going to have to give it a bad review now on Goodreads.
Right.
Sorry, my Goodreads friends.
It's been saved for now.
It's been saved for now.
By our hand alone.
It's been spared.
Yeah, but that's all I had to say about it, really. I think I've been talking too much about my own thoughts on war. But is there anything else you want to address before we head out?
No, I got to head out. I got to get to reading the next part.
That's right. That's important. We got to get right into it because you're about to get into some other important stuff. So for now, this has been this has been part 3 of book 4 of War and Peace. And before we totally wrap up, Matt, on a scale of, I know we're not doing the scale of 1 to Yeltsin anymore, but do you have any zingers you wanted to introduce to the crowd?
I feel like I could do a Yeltsin now that I'm drinking again.
Okay. Let's do a scale of 1 to Yeltsin.
Now that I'm back on the wagon.
The wagon.
People always say that when they're referring to drinking again.
You're right. When they say you start drinking, they do say you get on the wagon. That is what they say.
Yeah. No, probably 6 or 7. I'm feeling pretty good.
6 or 7. All right, nice.
Yeah,
nice.
I did have a few of Not Your Father's Root Beers prior to recording, so...
Hell yeah.
It helps to get through these tougher subjects.
Sure.
And also I like them.
That's the other big thing. That's the other important thing.
How about you?
I am probably a 5
Boo.
at this point. So, I mean, you could probably guess that by how much I've kind of wandered on and off the book itself just to talk about my own particular interest in the study of warfare. But
well, that's why we have the podcast. Captive audience.
Yeah, if you're here in episode whatever it is, 11, 10, I don't know, of War and Peace, and it's pretty captive. Matt, I gotta ask you though, what are we reading next episode?
Ooh, we're very close to being done. We're on part 4, book 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And then after that, I think we're gonna combine the epilogues and do the old epilogues in one episode. Call it a day. Retire from podcasting forever.
We've spent 5 months on War
Go
and
live
Peace.
in a tent. I'm done.
We deserve some peace.
I'm done.
As do you if you've listened to 5 straight months of War and Peace. Good on you. Good on you for following this long. Thank you for being here. You also deserve some peace. You deserve whatever the hell Pierre is on during his death march.
No kidding.
And before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons: Brenda, Nell Cool J, Christina, Marin, JG, Banana Karenina, Margarita, Yulia, Amanda, John, Natalie, Ben, James, Elizabeth, Shannon, Blake, Amanda, Maya, Packrob, Zachary, Austin, Isaac, Brett, Caitlin, Eli, Stephanie, Alex, Yitza, Mysterious Donor Dude, Elise, Allison, Brandon, Arini, Lou, Jesse, Paige, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Janice, Anne, Madeline, and Jeff. Podcasting isn't free, and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the podcast running at the rate it does now, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com. You'll hear from us again soon.